Welcome back, everyone. In this video, I want to discuss 4 facts about the lake of fire, which we read about in Revelation chapters 19 through 21. There are 4 passages in those chapters which mention the lake of fire, and all 4 are generally thought to be speaking of hell, or the final place where the wicked will be tormented for all eternity. And this video isn't going to be a detailed discussion of the book of Revelation, because, well, that would take an entire series of long videos, nor is this going to try and be a detailed and exhaustive treatise on the meaning of the lake of fire. No, today I just want to point out 4 facts about the lake of fire, things that are seldom mentioned or often completely overlooked when people try to use that material as proof for eternal torment. And I think these facts should at least get people thinking about whether or not the lake of fire really represents a hell or endless torment the way many believers have traditionally thought of it. So think of this video as food for thought or points for discussion. Again, it's by no means meant to be an exhaustive study. So the 4 passages we'll be considering are, first, Revelation 19:20, where we read, "And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone." And the second is in Revelation 20:10, where we read, "And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever." Then next in Revelation 20, verses 14 through 15, "And death and hell, or Hades, were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire." And then finally Revelation 21, verse 8, "But the fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars, shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." All right then, 4 facts about the lake of fire. Fact number 1, and this is one I think should be relatively uncontroversial, and that is that Revelation, in which the lake of fire language appears, is a book which is full of deep symbolism. Even for those who advocate for a more literal interpretation of the book of Revelation, well, I think even the staunchest literalist would admit that the book of Revelation is full of symbolism. I mean, Jesus is not literally a lamb, as he's referred to throughout the book, nor is the beast rising from the sea we read about at the beginning of Revelation 13 a literal beast, with literally 7 heads and 10 horns literally rising from a literal body of water. These are vivid symbolical representations which convey to us truths about the actual person or thing being symbolized. So, because the lake of fire appears within the context of so much symbolism, that, at the very least, should alert us that we need to be cautious when interpreting that language. So that's fact number 1. The book is full of symbolism, and because it is, we need to be careful in our interpretation. Okay, fact number 2, and this one is closely related to the first. Namely, that Revelation quite often defines its own symbolism by letting us know what a particular symbol represents. And this is a principle which can be found throughout the book. So, for example, in Revelation 1:20 we read, "The 7 stars are the 7 angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches." Or something like Revelation 4:5, where we find that the 7 lamps are the 7 spirits of God. Or Revelation 19:8, "The fine linen is the righteousness of the saints." And there are several more examples just like these which I could cite. Now, everyone understands this type of language. This symbolic thing is or represents this other thing in reality. But for some reason, this principle is too often ignored when many believers come to the lake of fire in both Revelation 20:14 and 21:8. In just the same way those other symbols are defined, in Revelation 20:14 we read, "And death and hell, or Hades, were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death." And again in Revelation 21:8, "The wicked shall have their part in the lake of fire, which is the second death." So just the same way the seven candlesticks are or represent seven churches, or the way the 10 horns of the beast are or represent 10 kings, in just that way the language of Revelation tells us that the lake of fire is or represents the second death. In other words, those words, second death, are defining and clarifying what that lake of fire symbolically represents, not the other way around. Revelation 20:14 and 21:8 don't say that the second death is the lake of fire. No, it says the lake of fire is the second death. Now, I do realize there's a significant manuscript variant on Revelation 20:14, where there's a second clause about the lake of fire. And instead of how that verse reads in the authorized version, we have something like, "And death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire." I'm not sure that changes the meaning, but depending on your Bible translation, I can see how some might question whether or not second death here is defining what the lake of fire is, or if it's the other way around. But there's no ambiguity at all when we come to Revelation 21:8, where the Greek phrase a estin, or that is used. The unbelievers will have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. A estin, that is the second death. That Greek phrase, a estin, and the way it's used here is also used throughout the New Testament in order to clarify something which the reader might find obscure. For example, we read in Colossians 1:24 where the Apostle Paul says, "Who now rejoice in my sufferings for you, and fill up that which is behind of the afflictions of Christ in my flesh for his body's sake, which is, a estin, the church." Notice here how the church clarifies what Paul meant by Christ's body. For his body's sake, which is, a estin, the church. It's what follows a estin, which is the defining and clarifying phrase. Body of Christ might have more than one meaning, but here Paul clarifies that. By the body of Christ, he means the church. And it would be absurd to try to reverse the language here by attaching a literal meaning to the word body, as in Jesus' literal physical body, and then insist that what Paul meant here was that the church is Jesus' literal physical body. Another example can be found in Mark 7:34, where we read, "And looking up to heaven he sighed, and saith unto him, Ephphatha, that is, a estin, be opened." Or in Mark 7:11, "If a man shall say to his father or mother, it is korban, that is, ha estin, to say a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, he shall be free." Notice in each of these verses that what follows a estin, or that is, it's what follows those words that's given to clarify something that the reader might find obscure. So when we come to Revelation 21:8, the lake of fire, that is, or a estin, the second death. Second death is the clarifying statement here, not the other way around. So whatever readers might think of the lake of fire, the emphasis should be on those words, second death, not on a literal interpretation of the words lake of fire. The phrase second death is given to clarify what the lake of fire is, or represents. And I'd also like you to consider that someone just reading through the book of Revelation would have already encountered that phrase second death twice. The first mention is in Revelation 2:11, where we read, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." Now, in this passage, second death appears completely unqualified, and there's no reason to think that the language here is a riddle. It makes little sense to think that if second death really meant torment in a lake of fire for all eternity, that we would have to read through the next 18 chapters before finding out the real definition, rather than finding it in its surrounding context, the way other symbols are defined throughout the book. Now, the second occurrence of second death is in Revelation 20, verse 6. "Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. On such the second death hath no power, but they shall be kings and priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years." And notice that the phrase second death is also here completely unqualified. And without getting too far into the weeds, I'm just going to point out that this language about a resurrection in which those who experience it are not subject to the second death sounds an awful lot like the words of Jesus, which we read about in Luke 20, verses 35 through 36, where he says that they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain that world in a resurrection from or out of the dead cannot die anymore. But anyway, the point here is simply this. When most Christians speak of the fate of the wicked, they say something like, they'll be in hell forever, or they'll be tormented forever in the lake of fire. Rarely, if ever, does anyone say they'll experience the second death. And why is that? Well, it seems it's because many might think that the phrase second death is too obscure, and that it may give people the wrong idea. So they use lake of fire instead because they think it's clearer than second death. But that's not at all the way Revelation is using those terms. Revelation twice uses the phrase second death completely unqualified. In the passage where the lake of fire appears, specifically those passages where the wicked or unbelievers are said to be cast into the lake of fire, that language is always qualified by the phrase second death. So I'm suggesting that when believers talk about the lake of fire, what they really need to be explaining are the words second death. And if that phrase appears to create ambiguity or questions about the doctrine of eternal torment, then perhaps it's time for believers to take a closer look at what those passages are really telling us. So that's fact number 2. The words second death define what the lake of fire is or represents, not the other way around. All right, fact number 3. The lake of fire's occupants raise serious questions about the correct interpretation of these verses. You know, when people often quote Revelation's lake of fire passages, they're quick to point to Revelation 20:15, where we read that whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Or to Revelation 19:20, where the beast and false prophet are cast into the lake of fire. Or even to Revelation 20:10, where the devil is cast into the lake of fire along with the beast and false prophet, and about which we read that they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. But rarely does anyone quote Revelation 20:14, where we read that death and Hades, or death and the grave, were cast into the lake of fire. And the reason for that's pretty obvious. The literal casting of death into an eternal hell, or a literal lake of fire, raises some serious questions. It's easy to imagine the devil or an individual antichrist and his cohort literally being cast into a fiery lake, and it's easy to imagine wicked individuals being cast into a literal lake of fire as well. But what's not so easy to explain is the language of Revelation 20:14. Death and Hades, or death and the grave, were cast into the lake of fire. Now, death is not an individual. Death is not even tangible. Death is a state, a condition, an abstract. How does one literally cast death into a literal lake of fire in the same way many imagine that the devil, the beast, the false prophet, or unbelievers are cast there? And folks, I want to suggest that unless you can adequately answer that question, your interpretation of the lake of fire may have some serious problems. The casting of some, the beast, unbelievers, etc., into the lake of fire cannot, on the one hand, be completely literal, a casting into a literal hell of fiery torment for all eternity, while at the same time being amorphous and symbolical in the same context when it comes to death and Hades. Death and Hades are said to be cast into the lake of fire in the same way and in the same immediate context in which unbelievers are said to be cast into the lake of fire. And if you have trouble grasping the literalness of the one, the literal casting of death into a literal lake of fire, then this should seriously make you question the literalness of the other, the casting of unbelievers into that same fire. Whatever we believe to be the meaning of both unbelievers or death being cast into the lake of fire, surely it can't mean two entirely different things within that same immediate context. So that's point number 3. If the lake of fire is the place of eternal torment, in what meaningful way is death cast into this place of eternal torment in just the same way unbelievers are cast there? All right, fact number 4. None of Revelation's 4 lake of fire passages say that unbelievers are tormented day and night forever and ever. Of those 4 passages, that phrase, tormented forever and ever, is found only in Revelation 20, verse 10, and is a description of the devil, the beast, and the false prophet only. When we come to Revelation 20:15, nothing is said about unbelievers being tormented forever in the lake of fire. On the contrary, as I pointed out earlier, in regard to unbelievers, the Bible is clear to define the lake of fire as the second death. In both cases where we read of unbelievers being cast there, both in Revelation 20:14 through 15 and in Revelation 21:8, we are told that the lake of fire is the second death. Now, I know someone is probably wondering about Revelation 14:9 through 11, where it says that the, quote, smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. And I've already made a 2-part detailed series on that passage, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, and I'll link to those videos down below. But to put it briefly, Revelation 14:9 through 11 is not a warning about the lake of fire, nor is it describing the lake of fire. And I think that's something that can be clearly demonstrated from the context. One must assume that Revelation 14:9 through 11 is a warning about the lake of fire. But I don't think that's an assumption which holds up under scrutiny. But I just want you to think about what's going on here. Any language about unbelievers being tormented in the lake of fire is completely absent from the context where that lake of fire is actually mentioned. So those who believe that unbelievers will be eternally tormented in the lake of fire must do at least one of 2 things. First, they must either assume that the eternal torment of unbelievers is implied by the language about the devil, the beast, and the false prophet being tormented forever. That because the devil, beast, and false prophet are said to be tormented forever in the lake of fire, that this must equally imply the eternal torment of the wicked. Or they must assume that the language of Revelation 14:9 through 11, the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever, a passage not even in the same context, in which, by the way, isn't even a warning to unbelievers in general, but only to those worshiping the beast, its image, or taking the mark of the beast, they must assume that that warning in Revelation 14:9 through 11 is a warning about the lake of fire. Now, on that first point, assuming that the lost will be tormented forever because that language is used of the devil, the beast, and the false prophet, a conclusion by way of inference. Well, to my mind, that's just a completely faulty assumption. First, because as I've stated, the language surrounding unbelievers being cast into the lake of fire is clarified by the words, second death. But second, because it's really just a complete non sequitur. It just does not follow that everything which is cast into the lake of fire experiences eternal torment. Remember, death and the grave, or death and Hades, are cast into the lake of fire. Can those also be tormented forever? So it just doesn't follow that everything which is cast into the lake of fire experiences eternal torment. Now, on that second point, about assuming that Revelation 14:9-11 and the smoke of their torment ascending forever and ever is about the lake of fire. As I've said, I think it can be clearly demonstrated that that passage isn't about the lake of fire at all. But even if we want to assume that it is, there are still issues. The main one being that it's not even a warning to unbelievers in general. It's a specific warning given at a specific time. And it's a warning only to those worshiping the beast or taking its mark. And I'll just say that that information is usually entirely omitted when people quote that passage. But not only that, the symbolism of perpetually rising smoke is taken from a passage in the book of Isaiah, where that judgment is clearly taking place on earth. And that same imagery is echoed again in the destruction of Babylon the Great in Revelation chapters 18-19. Again, a judgment clearly taking place on earth. And the imagery is completely absent when we come to the lake of fire. But my point here is just this. The eternal torment of unbelievers is not mentioned in any of the 4 lake of fire passages. That is a fact. You can only get there by way of inference or assumption. And because of that, the confidence which is often on display when people quote these passages as proof for eternal torment is really quite unjustified. Okay, so those are the 4 facts about the lake of fire. First, that Revelation as a whole is a highly symbolic book, and that alone should urge us to be cautious when interpreting its language. Second, that Revelation often defines its own symbols for us, and in the case of the lake of fire, the clarifying phrase which tells us what the lake of fire represents is second death. Third, that death and the grave are said to be cast into the lake of fire in just the same way unbelievers are said to be cast there. And this fact should help us guide our interpretation. It's not something that should be ignored. And finally, that the Bible just doesn't say unbelievers will be tormented in the lake of fire forever. That is a conclusion some reach, but only by way of inference or assumption. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. I hope that regardless of what you believe about the lake of fire, these facts will at least provide some food for thought. And as always, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who took the time to watch my last video. That one reached the largest audience by far of anything I've posted. So thank you to everyone who gave it a like, a comment, or a share. And I also want to give a welcome to everyone who's recently subscribed. With that last video, this channel has now grown to more than 100 subscribers, and that's been very encouraging to me. So, if you've also found this video helpful, let me know by giving it a like, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you'd like to see more content like this. And finally, always remember, God's love never fails. This is David with the Harvest Herald. I hope to catch you all again real soon in the next video.